Welcome to The Last Climb. I'm Alex, and today we're looking at a couple who paid a significant amount of money to attempt an Everest summit. Above the balcony, their pace had already drifted behind the turnaround schedule, and, carried by pride in the push upward, the growing gap to the summit window kept widening without correction. Knowing how it ended, that moment feels harder to look at now than it should. On May 19, 2016, Camp 4 on Mount Everest sat above 26,000 feet in the death zone, where temperatures had dropped to -24 degrees Fahrenheit, and climbers moved into the dark on fixed ropes toward the summit. Lowell DeVries, 52, was a commercial real estate developer from Austin, Texas. Diane DeVries, 49, co-owned a residential design studio. They had been married for 22 years and had gradually built a shared pattern of doing difficult structured objectives together. They had limited high-altitude experience, Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and a weather-forced retreat on Denali. That Denali turnaround stayed with Lowell more than expected. It was the first widely visible objective in years that did not end in completion. They later committed to Everest. The expedition cost approximately $570,000 and included guided support, staged oxygen systems, Sherpa assistance, and a fixed summit plan. By early 2016, the climb was publicly announced through Austin business media and sponsor-linked charity coverage, turning a private goal into something externally visible and tracked. The 2016 Everest season presented additional constraints. It was the first full reopening after the 2015 Nepal earthquake, leading to a backlog of expeditions. Teams were concentrated into a narrow summit window, a period of meteorological stability essential for a safe ascent. This window was shaped by unstable jet stream patterns and cyclone-driven weather systems, making precise forecasting critical. The convergence of multiple expeditions into this limited time frame created logistical challenges and increased traffic on the fixed lines, potentially impacting ascent rates and safety margins. The DeVries completed standard rotations between base camp and higher camps, building altitude tolerance step by step. It's a slow process, and it doesn't guarantee anything. They progressed from base camp to Camp 1, then a carry to Camp 2, and a rotation to Camp 3 without incident. Neither client needed to be evacuated or hit any medical cutoff that would have forced them off the climb. During the Camp 2 rotation, Diane developed a lingering dry cough, what climbers usually call the Khumbu cough. It's pretty common up there, but it can also be an early warning sign that the lungs are under strain, including more serious issues like HAPE. The expedition doctor kept an eye on it, but it never got bad enough to step her down or stop the rotation. It stayed with her through Camp 3 and was later mentioned to the base camp medical team. This observation, while not critical at the time, represented a subtle physiological signal that could become significant under greater duress. During the Camp 3 rotation, Lowell's resting blood oxygen saturation measured 58%. Lowell's oxygen saturation was 58%, above the intervention threshold, but close enough to matter in context. On paper, it's fine. On Everest, fine isn't always enough. The guide's expedition log recorded both climbers moving significantly below target pace, above 24,000 feet. This indicated a shortfall in physical efficiency that was not communicated to the clients, limiting their understanding of what the summit bid actually required. Between May 14th and May 17th, the DeVries remained at base camp, under enforced rest and observation, while other teams moved through a brief earlier summit window. Two guided expeditions reached the summit on May 15th and May 16th, and their photographs quickly circulated through base camp. Seeing others achieve the objective while they remained below created a growing psychological pressure and a quiet sense of urgency, one that was not fully aligned with weather forecasts or physiological readiness. That kind of thing sticks with people more than they expect, seeing others already on the summit when you're still waiting below. On May 17th, the guide presented the expedition meteorologist's forecasts to the DeVries. The May 19th to 20th window was identified as the best available option before Cyclone Roanu influenced. Deterioration closed the season for serious attempts. The meteorologist's analysis, based on satellite imagery, atmospheric pressure readings, and wind speed predictions, indicated a brief period of relative stability, This timing was critical to ensure sufficient daylight for the most technical sections and to avoid the increased wind speeds typically associated with midday. Continued progress to the south summit was planned, with a final summit arrival by 11 a.m. at the absolute latest. The parameters for the summit push were outlined with a strict timeline: departure from Camp 4 on the evening of May 19th, aiming for the balcony by 3:30 a.m., the south summit by late morning, and a final turnaround before 11 a.m. to allow descent before the weather window closed around 3 p.m. The plan left minimal margin for delay, but was considered feasible under optimal conditions. Lowell agreed to the plan without extended deliberation, his decision likely influenced by the perceived urgency and the public nature of their endeavor. Diane, consistent with their established dynamic, did not separate her decision from his, following his lead as she had in every prior objective framed as a joint accomplishment. Camp 4 sat above 26,000 feet, inside the death zone. Time spent here was already counted in physiological loss, not comfort. By this point, the body isn't adapting anymore. It's just holding on. In the final hours before the summit push, the De Vries rested in their tent, conserving energy. They checked oxygen systems, regulators, and bottles. Gloves and layering systems were inspected for integrity. They consumed what food they could, understanding the critical need for caloric intake, even with diminished appetite at altitude. Later that night, under darkness, they clipped onto the fixed line and began their upward movement. The initial 1,500 vertical feet above Camp 4, encompassing the triangular face, is a steep and physically demanding section. However, it is considered lower on the mountain's overall difficulty scale compared to the more technical terrain that follows. The guide saw both of them moving through this section at a steady, almost machine-like pace, the kind you only get on long nights when climbers are just putting one foot in front of the other. It was around minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit at the start, brutally cold, but still something they could work in. The wind was steady enough to be noticeable, but not strong enough to really throw them off or make every step a fight, which mattered for keeping their footing and avoiding frostbite. Oxygen was flowing at a rate of 2 liters per minute, a conservative setting designed to preserve the reserve supply for the critical descent phase. Lowell moved methodically, his movements deliberate and controlled. Diane maintained his pace through the early hours, demonstrating a consistent rhythm. The guide, positioned behind and slightly above them in rotation, allowed himself a cautious internal assessment. The pace was acceptable, the conditions were within operational limits, and the overall attempt appeared viable. The team successfully reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, approximately 15 minutes behind their predetermined schedule. At the balcony, the guide performed a critical mental calculation, later documented in the expedition incident report. To summit and return to Camp 4 before the weather window closed, the team needed to maintain or slightly improve their ascent rate. The guide's extensive experience in extreme altitude environments had taught him a fundamental principle. Pace at such elevations does not improve. It invariably degrades as fatigue accumulates and physiological stress intensifies. He noted this critical discrepancy internally, recognizing the inherent risk, but chose not to act on it immediately, perhaps hoping for an improvement in conditions or climber performance. While at the balcony, in the profound darkness of the pre-dawn hours, Diane removed her outer glove to adjust her oxygen mask strap. This minor mechanical correction at sea level would take 2 to 3 seconds. However, at 27,600 feet, in ambient temperatures of minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, and with wind speeds of 22 miles per hour, her bare hand was exposed to extreme cold for approximately 40 seconds before the glove was replaced. The guide observed this action. He noted that her fingers appeared cold but still functional, indicating that immediate frostbite had not occurred. But the risk was elevated. He did not verbally intervene. He would later document this specific incident in his formal incident report as the first observable sign of manual dexterity degradation, a critical clinical indicator at extreme altitude where fine motor skills are among the first to be compromised due to hypoxia and cold. Above the balcony, the terrain changes significantly. Fixed lines traverse increasingly iced and exposed rock sections toward the south summit. This segment demands deliberate and precise foot placement, constant vigilance regarding crampon contact with ice and rock, and motor precision inversely proportional to diminishing oxygen availability. This is where speed variations become operationally significant. Any delay, due to reduced pace or technical difficulty, compounds into the broader time calculation, jeopardizing the entire summit bid. Lowell's pace above the balcony led the guide to estimate their likely summit timing based on how fast they were actually moving. He figured they would reach the summit late in the morning, or closer to midday, with a chance it could slip later if their pace continued to slow. Working backward from that, it meant their descent from the upper mountain would likely push into the early evening at the earliest, depending on how many stops they needed and how conditions held. This is where plans on paper and reality on the mountain quietly stop matching each other. This directly conflicted with the weather window, projected to close in the mid-afternoon. By that stage of the day, climbers were supposed to be descending from the summit, not still pushing toward it. The deficit between normal summit timing and their actual pace was now measured in hours, not minutes. This was in conditions forecast to become actively dangerous after the weather window closed, with increasing winds and deteriorating visibility. Despite this critical assessment, the guide continued to observe and climb, maintaining his position behind the clients. Near the approach to the south summit, the guide stopped the team. A critical exchange followed, communicated not verbally, but through pre-agreed signals established during training at Camp 4. The guide clearly indicated their pace was insufficient, the summit bid no longer viable within safe parameters, and his professional recommendation was to initiate a descent. He signaled the critical time constraint, the significant pace deficit, and the unequivocal direction of retreat. At this juncture, the guide's recommendation transcended mere information. It became a direct, directional instruction, a request to abandon the objective for safety reasons. Lowell processed this information without visible hesitation. Lowell responded by shaking his head once, a clear refusal, and then pointed upward, indicating his unwavering intent to continue toward the summit. The guide, understanding the gravity, signaled again. He reiterated the time constraint, emphasizing the rapidly closing weather window. He re-indicated the pace differential, highlighting the growing gap between their actual progress and the required speed. And he clearly signaled for them to turn around. Lowell shook his head and pointed upward again. He didn't look at Diane, didn't pause, and gave no sign he was weighing the warning in real time. He just committed to the push. Then he turned and started moving upward again, continuing the climb. This is usually the moment where things stop being about the mountain and start being about the decision to keep going anyway. The guide, operating within his professional contract, did not possess the legal authority to compel a descent. His contract permitted him to descend independently if necessary for his own personal safety, absolving him of responsibility for the client's continued ascent. However, he did not exercise this option. Instead, he made the decision to follow his clients upward, a choice with profound consequences. The two Sherpa porters, positioned slightly below the main climbing party, exchanged a brief, unspoken look, a silent acknowledgement of the unfolding situation that neither client observed. They too followed, continuing their ascent behind the guide. At this point, oxygen reserve calculations became the primary constraint on all decisions. From the moment Lowell pointed upward, every subsequent action was shaped by the remaining oxygen supply and its limitations. The team was operating under a finite, resource, with each minute of continued ascent reducing the available margin for descent. At the south summit, both Lowell and Diane arrived and stopped. Diane, exhibiting profound fatigue and possibly early cerebral hypoxia, sat down without instruction and remained seated for 8 minutes. At this extreme altitude, prolonged static rest is a significant warning sign. The human body struggles to maintain core temperature without continuous movement, and heat production drops rapidly. Reduced oxygen to the brain affects the neurological drive to initiate movement, making stillness feel normal, even as conditions worsen. Diane remained seated, her oxygen system functioning, eyes open, indicating she was not unconscious. She eventually, with apparent effort, stood and continued her ascent. The guide then took the lead, setting the pace toward the Hillary Step and the final ridge. From other cases, resting at that altitude has a different meaning. Lowell DeVries reached the summit of Mount Everest on May 20th, 2016. He was the first team member to stand at the top, a culmination of years of training and significant financial investment. He had climbed through the night and morning, enduring extreme temperatures and increasing winds. He reached the highest point on Earth in the late morning. Diane arrived shortly after noon, approximately 14 minutes later. Both clients stood at the summit, briefly but long enough for the objective to be formally completed and documented. From a distance, this is the success moment. From inside the climb, it's already the beginning of the way down. Neither client's face is clearly visible in any of the summit images, likely due to oxygen masks, goggles, and hoods. However, the photographs unequivocally confirm the summit, the distinctive geometry of the ridge, the visible curvature of the horizon, and the position of the Tibetan Plateau visible to the north. They are summit photographs in every documentable sense, providing irrefutable evidence of their achievement. The guide initiated the descent shortly after their arrival at the summit, without ceremony or extended celebration. He immediately set a brisk downward pace, acutely aware of the rapidly closing weather window, projected to shut in less than 3 hours. The team faced approximately 8,800 vertical feet of highly technical terrain to descend, in conditions already shifting, with increasing wind and potential for deteriorating visibility. He understood the immense physical and mental demands the next 6 hours would impose. The descent was noticeably slower than the climb up, which is normal at that altitude. Going down is harder in a different way. Your legs are more fatigued and every step takes more control. You're also dealing with gear like jumars and descenders, which require steady hands and focus, both of which get worse in the cold and thin air. Still, what the guide was seeing was beyond what he would normally expect, even for a slow descent at that height. Above the Hillary step, Diane's footwork became noticeably unsteady. While she did not fall, her jumar clipped correctly. Her movements lacked deliberate precision. Her feet dragged slightly, indicating loss of fine motor control and coordination. She was not accurately reading the rock and ice contours, suggesting cognitive impairment. In response, the guide increased her oxygen flow from 2 liters per minute to 4 liters per minute. This adjustment, while providing a temporary physiological boost, had immediate and unfavorable reserve consequences. The higher flow rate would exhaust her primary summit bottle significantly faster, bringing forward the critical moment when the team would become entirely dependent on backup reserves, thereby shortening their operational window. At the south summit during descent, Lowell stopped for an unscheduled 12-minute rest. This pause at a critical juncture, combined with worsening weather, raised concern. Winds were sustained at 34 miles per hour, with gusts up to 44 miles per hour, and temperatures at 31 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. The weather window was closing faster than forecast, indicating rapid deterioration. The guide, acutely aware of these converging factors, did not rest. He remained vigilant, constantly monitoring the ridge for changes in terrain, scanning the sky for signs of worsening weather, and meticulously tracking the dwindling time. Below the south summit, on the descent toward the balcony, Diane collapsed to her knees on the fixed line. Her jumar caught her, preventing a fall, but she was unable to stand up under her own power. This indicated severe loss of muscular strength and coordination, likely exacerbated by extreme fatigue and hypoxia. A Sherpa porter immediately moved to her side and physically lifted her back to a standing position. She remained oriented but lacked the physical capacity to generate the necessary upward force. Recognizing her severe condition, the Sherpa clipped his harness to hers and initiated a physical assist descent, providing continuous supplemental force. At this point, the climb is no longer about progress. It's about whether the body can still respond at all. Lowell, approximately 30 feet below, did not fully register the gravity of the situation, preoccupied with his own precarious movement, a testament to tunnel vision under extreme stress and hypoxia. He continued his descent, unaware of Diane's full incapacitation. The guide, observing, made a critical assessment. He had one client in a full physical assist descent, requiring constant Sherpa support, and another struggling. The guide was the third operational member. Diane's primary summit oxygen bottle emptied, forcing a switch to her backup. Lowell's backup bottle read only 40% capacity. The combined remaining oxygen supply had a calculable, rapidly approaching endpoint. At current flow rates and accounting for Diane's physical assist descent, the mathematical projection resolved to an operational window of mere hours, demonstrably shorter than the estimated time to reach Camp 4 at their degraded pace. The guide determined that continuing the assisted descent in 58-mile-per-hour wind gusts, coupled with Diane's compromised mobility, presented an unacceptable fall risk. He identified a marginal depression in the ridge at 28,400 feet, offering minimal wind reduction. He made the difficult decision to stop the team there. From there, he radioed base camp with their exact location, along with an update on Diane's condition and how low their oxygen supply was getting. Base camp acknowledged the call. A helicopter evacuation was considered, but with the altitude above 23,000 feet and the wind conditions at that level, a night extraction wasn't possible, leaving the team stuck where they were. In a follow-up transmission, the guide provided details on the dire oxygen situation and the balcony cache below. Faced with remaining or retrieving supplies, he decided to descend alone for an oxygen bottle. He left the two Sherpa porters with the debris at 28,400 feet, instructing them to provide comfort. He reached the balcony cache, secured the bottle, and began the arduous return ascent. Approximately 300 feet above the balcony, he could not continue upward. Wind gusts were now hitting hard enough to repeatedly knock him sideways during upward movement, and spindrift was stripping visibility off the fixed line. He made several attempts, but it proved impossible. He transmitted this critical update to base camp later that evening. He then made the agonizing decision to descend to Camp 4, arriving about an hour and a half later, physically and emotionally spent. Meanwhile, the two Sherpa porters at 28,400 feet maintained intermittent radio contact with Camp 4. Transmissions were disrupted by wind, but consistent enough to track the situation. One Sherpa reported Lowell sitting against the fixed line anchor, unresponsive to prompting, indicating severe decline in consciousness. In a subsequent update, the same porter reported Diane breathing but unrousable, suggesting deepening unconsciousness or coma. Further transmission confirmed both clients unresponsive, a definitive sign of critical physiological failure. Shortly after, the functional radio porter reported his own condition rapidly deteriorating due to hypothermia and exhaustion. He began a solo descent, his radio failing soon after. The other Sherpa remained. By the time communications ceased, base camp logged definitive loss of radio contact from 28,400 feet. Once communication starts breaking down up there, everything becomes smaller and more local. Just the next few meters, not the outcome. At first light on May 21st, a two-person Sherpa recovery team left Camp 4 early in the morning. They were equipped with supplemental oxygen, hot fluids, and emergency thermal supplies. They climbed through conditions that had moderated but not normalized, winds still above 30 miles per hour at the upper ridge, temperature well below zero. They reached the position at 28,400 feet approximately 4 hours after departing Camp 4. Lowell DeVries and Diane DeVries were both deceased. They were found in a partially seated, partially slumped position against the fixed line anchor, precisely where they had ceased voluntary movement. Both oxygen backup bottles were fully exhausted. Diane's left hand was ungloved, either removed during terminal cold confusion or taken by wind. Lowell's oxygen mask was partially displaced, indicating a possible struggle or loss of consciousness. There was no evidence of falls, equipment malfunctions, or external injury. The position was consistent with individuals who had ceased voluntary movement and succumbed to extreme conditions. The Sherpa porter who had remained was found alive, severely hypothermic and non-communicative. He was assisted down to Camp 4 and evacuated, receiving extensive medical treatment in Kathmandu for hypothermia and frostbite, and ultimately survived. The bodies of Lowell and Diane DeVries remained at 28,400 feet for 4 days. A recovery operation coordinated between the guiding company, Nepalese climbing authorities, and a specialist Sherpa team required a secondary weather window and 12 additional personnel to execute safely. The couple was brought to base camp on May 25th, airlifted to Kathmandu, and repatriated to Austin, Texas. The costs of the recovery operation were covered by an insurance clause included in the original expedition package, a provision the DeVries had paid for as part of the $570,000 agreement. Post-mortem examination conducted in Kathmandu, with supplementary pathology review completed in Austin, identified the primary cause of death for both individuals as high-altitude cerebral edema. a condition in which the brain swells in response to prolonged insufficient oxygen at extreme elevation, progressively degrading coordination, judgment, and consciousness before producing irreversible neurological damage and death. Secondary contributing factors listed in the documentation were hypothermia and a hypoxic cardiac event in Lowell's case. No traumatic injuries were found on either body. The medical examiner's documentation noted that high-altitude cerebral edema at extreme elevation is clinically indistinguishable from ordinary exhaustion until the point at which motor and cognitive function have already been compromised beyond the threshold of self-rescue. Both individuals died at the location where their movement stopped. The guiding company's internal incident report, reviewed by Nepalese climbing authorities as part of a standard post-fatality investigation, recorded the guide's turnaround recommendation and the client's decision to continue. It concluded that the guide followed established protocol at every decision point available to him. No regulatory action was taken against any party. The $41,000 raised in the Austin charity auction, pledged against a verified summit, was donated in full by the co-sponsoring firms, without condition, after the deaths were confirmed. The disbursement clause had required a summit. There had been one. The money was released,